They should have destroyed all the Rings of Power at this time, but they failed to find the strength. Hey everyone, Yoiston here, and I hope you all are doing well, wherever you are in Middle-earth. Today we will be taking a look at what the original purpose behind the Rings of Power, the artifacts, not the show, was. Sources for today are linked in the description and cards. My friends, thank you all so much for joining me today. Let's begin our tale. Let's begin by looking at the tale of Eregion, and why the first rings were created by Annatar and his apprentices among the Gwaith y Myrdain, the jewel crafters. While originally many of the rings forged by the elves were essays and lesser crafts, artifacts that granted small or weak power, they were nothing compared to the rings that would come later. Now, as it is told in the Unfinished Tales, the interesting thing about this time period is that after the Rings of Power were fully forged in approximately 1500 of the Second Age, it seems that the Dwarven Rings remained in elven hands for a time but would eventually be given to the dwarves, either by elves or by Sauron himself, as there is a bit of an inconsistency in the canon there. Indeed, the Greater 16 as they were known, the rings that would eventually be known as the 9 for men and the 7 for dwarves, were named Greater Rings as they held more power and were greater works by the ringsmiths than were those lesser rings, the amount of which we know not. By the time Sauron arrived in Eregion during the War of the Elves and Sauron, and took and captured Celebrimbor to find the location of the Rings of Power, it seems that the 7 Dwarven Rings had actually already been given, yet he did recover the 9 Rings of Men. Of the 3, Celebrimbor would truly say nothing, no matter how much he was tortured, for they had been made differently than the others, and were, to him, far more precious than any of the other rings, and while they still fell under the control of the One, as they had been made with the teachings of Sauron, they were made with far less influence from Sauron directly, and the Elfsmith would just not give them up. Now, of course, this is mostly review, as we know most of this from The Lord of the Rings, though it was worth establishing for the sake of my next point, as well as for the fact of pointing out some possible inconsistencies, which may lead to some interesting beliefs on my part about all of this. So, what was the original point of the Rings of Power? It seems to me that the Greater 16 Rings were not originally intended for dwarves and men, but for elves, for the Noldor of Eregion in particular, and perhaps some of the elves in other lands. The Jewelsmiths had of course been deceived by Sauron, who was Annatar, yet when Sauron forged the One Ring around 1600, across the lands in Mordor, the elves immediately became aware of his attempt to dominate them, as at least the bearers of the 3 elven rings sensed him and took off their 3 rings. Now, this is interesting because apparently, unless Sauron acted too hastily or arrogantly, he thought that he had created enough rings to dominate the minds of the bearers of the 16 rings already, because he knew nothing about the 3 elven rings until he put on the One Ring and sensed them as well. This has always astounded me, because Sauron must have thought that either in putting on his One Ring, no one else at that same time had the 16 on, or they would have instantly fallen under his corruption if they did, or something along those lines, or that he thought they would have them on, and expected them to just fall anyway, which tells me that he did originally intend for elves to wear all 16 of those rings in the first place, and through them, he would be able to conquer the West, or at least defeat the other elves. Yet, the interesting thing is that Sauron made and wore the One Ring before ensuring he knew who had and wore each of the 16 Greater Rings, because he would afterwards seek to retrieve them when his plan failed. Therefore, I must imagine that he wanted elven craftsmen to be his thralls, perhaps in order to make more artifacts of power for him, maybe even more rings. It just always strikes me as strange that Sauron chose the moment he did, after all of these centuries of planning and preparation to reveal himself, rather than creating the One Ring and ensuring that the bearers of the 16 Greater Rings, who he would attempt to dominate, were exactly who he wanted them to be before putting on his ring. Because again, the Dwarven Rings, it seems, were not in Eregion anymore, and the 9 were, which he was able to recapture, but then he discovered that there were also 3 Elven Rings that he was not able to ever capture. Again, unless the Unfinished Tales contradicts what Tolkien would have considered to be canon, in which case Sauron would have found and distributed the Dwarven Rings, the point still stands that Sauron didn't exactly know where each one was when he donned his One Ring. This didn't work for him, and he would be forced to improvise his plans, retrieve as many rings as he could, and then redistribute them to men and maybe to dwarves as well, if they didn't already have them, and try to crush the elves in the process, which he almost did during this war until the Númenóreans showed up to help the elves. Again, while I love the mythological story at play here, Sauron's own character flaws must have been really coming through in these actions, because even after his plan was going so smoothly for hundreds of years, with the only thing that could have made it even better being his form of Anatar tricking Gil-galad, Elrond, and Galadriel, which it did not, he still revealed himself at the most inopportune time, which destroyed his centuries-long plan and made him change it into the plot of the rings that we know today. If you're curious about more of Sauron's overarching plans throughout the ages, and how he constantly had to revise his strategies, please check out my video on that. And so, with Sauron's failure here and the outbreak of the War of the Elves and Sauron due to the failure of his plan, we come to the end of our tale on the original point of the Rings of Power. From this tale, we actually learn the most from Sauron's failure, which was fortunate for the free peoples of Middle-earth. We see that we must hold true to the course of the plans we make, for the opportune moment to execute them only comes once. Thank you all so much for watching. I hope you all enjoyed today's video. If you did, please be sure to hit that like button and share this with a friend. What are your thoughts on the original point of the Rings of Power? Let me know in the comments below. I do like how both sides made mistakes in this part of the story. For after Sauron revealed himself, but did not start his invasion, free peoples should have destroyed their Rings of Power, but could not bring themselves to do so, yet Sauron was still playing catch-up from his own mistakes as well. If you'd like to support the channel, please consider getting some candles for our friends Mythologie Candles, or order some Weta or United Cutlery, Lord of the Rings swords, statues, and other replicas from Castle Con, who does international shipping. Use the code WEST at checkout. Please check out our merch and Patreon as well. Thanks to our Valor tier patrons and YouTube members: Peter Shepard, Jonathan Putnam, Blair Scouten, Merton, John Hume, Sam McBee, Elizabeth Calvert, Maz Gibbs, Reese Jenkins, Adam Petrolake, Anthony Harmon, Arthur Merlin, Dale Davis, Kingswald Project, Robert Bogue, King of Games 2500, Theodore, and Moon Viper, our newest Valor tier patron. Thank you so much to all of you guys, it means a lot. Please subscribe and hit that bell button to join the Men of the West and all of the free peoples today. And I'll see you all again next week with a video revisiting the Rings of Power 1 year later, seeing what went wrong, and perhaps what they could do to fix Season 2. My friends, thank you all so much for joining me on this adventure. Until the next one.